Sure. Before I have Michael Aaron take over the program, he's slyly disguised as John Farmer sitting at the end. I thought we'd go a little bit out of order. I'd like to talk just a couple minutes about the sort of search of the archives. You see in this slideshow some of the documents that we found mostly in the Byrne papers, but we've also been looking in the state archives for other governors. We've scanned various papers from the Minor and Kane administrations. We found some very interesting things that we hoped all to put online. I'd encourage you, if you have in your own basements or files anything interesting that you think might build our archive on New Jersey politics, no matter what governor or what race, I think it'd be interesting to add it to our overall archive. We're also talking at Eagleton about building a more general political archive, and we've had some recent discussions about donations of campaign buttons, posters of national significance. So if any of you have anything that you'd like to discuss with us for scanning, we don't really need the original materials, we just would like an image of them so that we can make them accessible on the internet, please do. Some of the documents you'll see are from Governor Byrne's campaigns. We've also scanned some other things. Greg, could you move it along? But most of it is a mix of policy and political documents. One of the exchanges that I think I found the most interesting is the exchange between Dick Leone, who's supposed to be here this morning, may get here yet, and Cliff Goldman about whether it's a good idea or not to send a check directly for the homestead rebates to taxpayers. And Dick's response to Cliff that it's crucial that a check be sent. And during our series of interviews, we've also interviewed Ray Bateman about how depressed he was when he came home from a hard day of campaigning, opened his mail, and saw that his homestead rebate check had arrived. Ray said in his interview he then started to write his concession speech. In any event, I know some of you have time problems, so I'd like to go a little bit out of order. Al Burstein and Jerry English have to go to an Election Law Enforcement Commission meeting this morning, so they have to leave early. I'd like Jerry to start, just talk a little bit about a couple memories you might have of the campaigns you've been involved in, and also talk a little bit about what you're up to now. Jerry?
First of all, Governor, I must tell you that we all had other lives until we ran into you. And suddenly, our opportunities really changed, because looking back, a sea change, we came post-Watergate, we came at a time when there was allegedly a really fresh opportunity for open government, and the very first bill when I was your legislative counsel that we passed was for the public financing of gubernatorial campaigns. As we say, be careful what you get started, because you may end up having to run it. And that's what Al Burstein and I are now doing. And some of the people in this room, where is Doug Forrest? Yes. He had to be before us because the Election Law Enforcement Commission continues to operate, except now we not only look at gubernatorial activities, we look at all elections that are statewide and municipal, and it goes down to forest, fire districts, which is, I never even knew they had elections, much less that we were in charge of them.
Election.
Oh, please, this is what it was like to be with him all the time. We find ourselves now with such an enlarged opportunity, because we have moved beyond this small, literally, approach, which was to try and balance out the opportunities for people, regular people, to run for governor, now to the Clean Elections campaign, which is regular people to run in our assembly and senatorial districts in a second time around. So we'll have hearings on December 18th. I assure you that I would love to see all of you up here, because it ain't perfect. And it will continue to need to have this type of public attention so that transparency, easy to say, very difficult to achieve, is something that started, again, with the Byrne administration. And as I was saying to Chairman Alan Sagner when we were on the Port Authority together, I remember former Mayor Wagner, who was a member of our commission, of the Port Authority, getting in a cab one day, and the cabbie looks back at him, just to put this all into perspective, and he sees the mayor sitting there, and he says, "Geez, and we thought you were bad." Well, we all have that type of perspective. And it goes on with, I think, the commitment of most people to try and have this be as even an opportunity for public service as we can achieve. Not perfect. We'll keep working on it, but we will need the staff, we'll need the people, we'll need the rules and regulations to really make it work. Thank you.
Al, do you want to say just a few things about some of the campaign memories you have?
Yes, just two hopefully brief points. The first is it's almost serendipitous that the time span that is the subject of today's discussion starts in 1977. And I recall that campaign very clearly, and Brendan coming to Bergen County probably sometime around late October. And before that campaign started, the word around the state was this was OTB Byrne. Now, OTB, for the uninitiated, was off-track betting in some of the parlors around the neighboring state of New York, but they transformed it in the newspaper lingo to one-term Byrne. Now, the off-track betting parlors slowly disappeared into the mist, but not Brendan, because as that campaign wore on, there was a discernible shift in sentiment as some of the tax issues, which was primary amongst the voters at that time, came to the fore. And I recall Brendan coming to Englewood, and we were walking up and down the main street of the town, and people discernibly were coming forward to see Brendan and talk with him. And this was just a kind of a door-to-door sidewalk campaign. And you got the feeling of a surging interest and favorable interest in his campaign. And one of the unfortunate byproducts was that it gave rise to one of Brendan's famous lines in his speeches about people coming forward to him with all five fingers extended. And he used that in almost every speech thereafter. But it was an interesting campaign in that you could see the change that evolved from the beginning to Election Day. And one of the more extraordinary campaigns that I was ever a participant in. The other thing that I would like to briefly mention is on the general issue of public campaign financing. When I was elected to my first term, which was in 1971, one of the first things that I was involved in was putting together an overall campaign finance bill. It obviously went nowhere in the 72-3 session of the legislature. However, when Brendan took office in when the governor took office in 1973, you were elected in 73.
Yes, took office.
Took office, you're right. Oh, yeah. I've got to be precise around here. When the governor took office in 1974, one of his first measures that he wanted to see put into law, and Bob Raymar, I think from your staff, Governor, was the one I worked with on it, was the first gubernatorial general election campaign bill. And it took a bit of doing, but it got through. Looking at that in perspective 30 approximate years later, I see an erosion in what the original goals were of putting public campaign financing in place. Part of the erosion is quite evident. That is to say, it has given rise to persons of wealth who will opt out of the system. And that tends to eviscerate at least some of the goals of public campaign financing. And I think as well that experiments that we're going through, such as the Clean Elections Bill, while it has its uses as a kind of laboratory experiment, has a long way to go in determining whether this is a good system statewide, because that's the whole purpose of going through these model districts, I assume. And my feeling is that there's a good distance between an effective statewide system that will protect the sanctity of what our objectives are in public financing before we get to that point. So there's a lot of work still to be done, and after 30 years, I'm not at all sure there is an effective way of doing it.
Alan, I know you have a time problem too. Do you want to talk?
Well, just a brief comment on what Jory and Al said is that I am all in favor of good government and public financing, but I want to say for the record, I'm very glad that we didn't have it back in the 70s. Because if I hadn't been drafted to be Brendan's finance chairman, I would have gone on, stayed in the building business, made a lot of money, and be happily retired now. And because I was drafted for that job, it changed my life and made me...
Changed mine too, because you were very successful.
It was a wonderful experience, and I'm indebted to all those who helped. And one other comment is that I'm spending a lot of time in Florida now, happily. And when I hear people criticize New Jersey, its government, its finances, its legislators, I'm on firm ground there to defend my state against what's happening in Florida. They're struggling now to change their property tax. And their solutions, from what I read in the local paper, is debating how much to take away from the school budgets and how much to raise the sales tax. So when people criticize our state, there are people who are worse. And a lot of things that we can do to improve our state.
And we'll find them.
Senator McCryan, I think you have a little bit of a time problem. Do you want to say something?
Sure, thank you. Governor, I have to tell you, the first thing I'd like to do is, and I was listening to Alan Seidman and Jerry and I were talking, I would love to be able to run a campaign that didn't have finance limits and campaign limits and see how that goes. But if you don't mind, I'd share a story with you. My father had the good fortune of serving in public office when you were governor, and I learned a lesson or two. And if you don't mind me sharing a quick memory, as a kid, when I was in your first term, and I realized this really starts at 77, I was 11 years old, and actually had the good fortune of my father sitting down and explaining to me how you were going to win to be governor. This was post-primary, obviously, but the story about how the cities had to turn out in the Democratic Party and what the vote counts were. And if you don't mind me saying, your first campaign was my first lesson into politics in terms of how to get a voter turnout, how people actually had to turn to the Democratic line. That's where I really first learned that line A all the way meant something. And you were actually the first real campaign that I recall where I dropped brochures and was up in West Orange at the ShopRites and the Pathmarks and doing the flyers and sitting in RVs and microphones and so on. But if you don't mind me saying that one of the opportunities and privileges there is to be Democratic Party chairman is to be able to refer to Governor Byrne. And at a time when we take a lot of hits on whether it's ethics or anything else, we have the highest of standards because we can point to Brendan Byrne. And as a result, that always gives a party credibility. It gives me an opportunity as a party chairman to point to what is absolutely the very best of government, and that's in your integrity and your process and your passion. If you don't mind me commenting as well, and that would be on clean elections, which public financing I understand is important and that we look to take money out of the process, although I wouldn't mind getting Sagner without any limits once as well. But as I look at clean elections and part of your legacy is public financing is one, it's not only can a state afford it, but two is whether or not it actually increases voter participation. One of the things I learned from this election cycle is that it doesn't. And it frankly did not bring what I thought would be an opportunity for people to come out and take money out of politics and therefore be more rejuvenated into the process. That clearly didn't work in this November '07 election cycle. And I wonder, as in the future the program goes on, because I think all of us would agree, what we want to do is not see 30% turnouts. We didn't have a 30% turnout in 1977. Obviously, it was gubernatorial year, and I don't know the turnout, but I bet it was a lot higher than the last turnout for gubernatorial election. And I think one of the emphasis, and I heard Alan talk, Albert Bernstein talk as well about the story about you in Inglewood. Retail politics has undergone a transformation in the last 30 years. We've gone from Brendan Byrne walking in Inglewood and knocking on doors or saying hello to people. We've gone to a media market with cable and technology, and now with communications and internet. And frankly, I think, Governor, what's happening is and I would argue that a lot of this is because of your interests and your policies, that we are transitioning now from a party of just media and not being able to connect to voters to having to go back to what we all talk about, which is grassroots, which means putting your face, your principles, and yourself before the public, not just on a TV screen, but presenting yourself, and which you did to the highest of character and standards. And I hope that as we move forward, that we present candidates that, frankly, hopefully can at least hold a candle to you. That's what that is.
Don't leave.
I got to live with this guy. I mean, it's going to be an issue tomorrow at breakfast.
Great family, the Cryan family.
I'm not sure if he has a time problem, but Senator Lance may well be out to announce his candidacy for another. Leonard, do you want to speak a little bit? Leonard, by the way, was a student of Governor Byrne and I many, many years ago.
I view the governorship in this state as cyclical. There was a marvelous photograph of Governor Minor with President Kennedy and with Dick Hughes. I think that was probably taken in Trenton, perhaps the Thursday before election at the War Memorial when the President of the United States came to campaign for Dick Hughes. In modern history, that's the only time that there has been a succession of one party to the same party. And since then, we've gone back and forth from Hughes to Cahill, from Cahill to Byrne, from Byrne to Kane, from Kane to Florio, from Florio to Whitman, from Whitman to McGreevey. And I view the Corzine governorship as really an extension of the Democratic victory in 2001. And so I view the modern governorship as cyclical, and I would imagine that that would continue. And of course, there is modification now based upon cable television as well as commercial television and the internet, an increasingly important part of campaigning. Regarding the clean election experiment, I believe it needs to be improved significantly. I believe on the split district that should be chosen in a nonpartisan capacity. At the moment, the tie-breaking member of that commission is chosen by the two leaders of the legislature, the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the Assembly, and I would prefer a system where there is a nonpartisan choice of that district. I also think, frankly, that $3 million is too much money for a single legislative district, and probably the amounts of money should be lowered. And very definitely regarding clean elections, they should apply to primaries as well as general elections, because most legislative races in this state are ultimately determined in the primary, not in the general election.
Why don't we start now, unless someone else has a critical time problem, at the end of this table. Michael?
Yeah, let me stand up so I can see the people on both sides of the room and say what an impressive room it is and how nice it is to have all of you here and how difficult it's going to be to keep a conversation moving among 20 people, but I'll do my best. Usually it's 2 people or 4 people. Don gave me a perfect starting place with Brendan Byrne saying a year ago that he wouldn't run in today's climate. But before we get there, I just want to follow up a little bit on where we've just been. When Joe Cryan said that the clean elections experiment struck him as in part a failure because of the turnout not being juiced up at all by it, I immediately thought, okay, well, that's because there are no competitive races or so few competitive races. And I put my journalist hat on and we journalists don't like gerrymandering. We think you're robbing us of a lot of fun. But then I remembered that I was struck by something that Alan Rosenthal was quoted as saying just a week ago. After the election, Alan, you were quoted as saying that gerrymandering is a good thing because it provides stability in the legislature. Did you say that, and do you think that?
I may have said that. I said it in a broader context, but one of the advantages of it is that can you imagine if you had 40 contested elections?
Be great.
40,
be great.
It would be great for the media, but it wouldn't be. It might not be great for the political system. And then just imagine how much money would have to be raised for the 40. It wouldn't be just the 12th district. It would be 40 districts. Imagine much higher turnover. So I'm not. I think a little gerrymandering is good. A lot of gerrymandering is.
And what do you think we have in New Jersey legislatively?
I had nothing to do with it. That's you've got to go down to Princeton.
Another thing to follow up on before we get to the question I raised a second ago is it's good to see Doug Forrester among us, and having heard who was it who said just 10 minutes ago that the spirit, I guess it was Al Burstein who said that the spirit of the gubernatorial public financing law has been eroded by people of means getting into the race and ignoring the law. What's your thought, having been the object of one of the objects of that comment?
Can we go back to the ignoring the law part?
Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about expressing indifference to the public.
Doing it differently.
I understand. My own thoughts about that have evolved a little bit. I think that there should be significant caps on general election spending. I don't think there should be caps on primary spending. I think primaries are different kinds of animals, and I think political parties need to be accountable for their candidates. I think one of the problems that we have in New Jersey is that the political parties aren't strong enough. I think they need to be stronger and more accountable. I think, frankly, one of the problems with the 2002 ballot swap is that it ultimately weakens the political parties in terms of accountability to candidates. I think that I would, speaking of the 2002 election, I would add a corollary that I think that the campaigns of the state committee of those who the sponsor withdrawing candidates should repay to the candidates that are not that see it through to the finish line the amount of money that they have spent up to the point of withdrawal. Now that's said somewhat facetiously, but I honestly think that there should be campaign caps on general election spending, but not primary spending.
U.S. Senate or just governor?
I think all. I think both.
Anybody have a thought on whether we should cap spending, general election spending?
Can we do that?
Can we do it?
Yes. Is that not unconstitutional or not?
That's a good question. All right, let me go to the question that Don raised with me, and that I think is a good, I was going to say starting point, but we've already started, a good pivot point. And that is, apparently, Governor Byrne, you said in a gathering such as this a year ago that if asked to run today for public office, given the way campaigns and elections have changed since the 70s, you wouldn't do it today. Did you say that? And if so, why?
First of all, I think 1 million New Jersey voters would agree with me that I shouldn't run again. It's dirty today. It really is dirty. And if you take that race, the culture race, we never got to the issues in that race. We got to how many cows you had, or whether you paid a traffic ticket. You didn't know where either of those ladies, and both very talented ladies, I would have liked to have heard more. But that's the kind of thing you're in for in an election today, and it doesn't appeal to me.
Who wants to pick up on that? That it's dirty. Go ahead, Joe.
Sure. As state chairman, I can tell you, and Governor, you're familiar with this, we've turned a lot of people away from the process. Good people who don't want to be involved because of the type of negativity we go through. And it has become more and more, when you look at the kind of turnouts we have, and declining turnouts each and every year. And yet we say, we say negative campaigning works, but what we're doing is we're turning away an entire part of the electorate to this process. And I would argue, and without sharing, we are obviously on the day after the announcement that Mike Ferguson would run. And just to kind of shift gears a little bit, but go back to your original point, as party chairman, I got 2 calls yesterday from people who told me that their main attribute was that they would self-finance. And that was a great thing. And I just thought to myself, if that's your attribute, now I'm not saying that they're not wonderful people in their own right, and I'll never share their names, but we're losing a sense of that you've got to touch people at a lot of different levels. And what we're doing is, I would argue that many people have means. I know that people in this room have means. But you've got to be out there among people, and you've got to understand middle class to win in New Jersey. And I think self-financing becomes a very negative part of the process, and it adds to the dirty.
Does anybody who has run... Go ahead, Ruthie. You want to make...
I was going to ask a question of Joe. If you could change the process with no restrictions, just tell us what you would do to change the process. Nobody's going to buck you on this.
Well, in terms of fundraising, what I'd do is I'd make the limits lower and do instant reporting.
Instant reporting?
Instant reporting. If Michael Aaron donates to my campaign today, it's on my website tomorrow. And frankly, in this day and age in technology, with great respect to the folks in the Elect Commission, I think you ought to be able to click on who donated to me as of yesterday. I think limits should be standard.
You agree with what Doug said, that we should cap general election spending?
No, I don't. But I think you ought to not be able to self-finance, and I think you ought to be able to show. What we do now is we do 29-day reports, and then in 48 hours. So we acknowledge the need for instant reporting already, because you've got to do 48 hours at every level. Why don't we do it every day? Why can't people, if they want to have integrity in the process, click on my website, 2 clicks later, be able to see who donated to me up to yesterday, click on my voting record one later, and understand exactly what's going on if they're that interested in the process. I think what that does is make political people touch people, because I happen to agree with Alan. You need safe seats, but what happens with safe seats is you lose contact with the public.
But wait, Brendan talked about the Karcher Beck race. Nobody heard the issues. There were no issues in that campaign that anybody...
there really were.
There were.
If you attended the debates or moderated a debate, there were issues, but...
You didn't know about them.
You didn't know about them from television commercials or from news coverage, because that stuff doesn't get covered as readily as an attack. An attack gets covered because it's interesting.
It's interesting, but Brendan's point was that's all the voter heard. I'm saying all. I'm saying 99%. I'm asking Joe, what would you do if you could control that, because that certainly turns off the voter, correct? That was your point.
Right.
So, and turns off people who would perhaps enter the political process. What would you do to control those ads, to control that whole process?
I don't have a great answer for you. I will say this: I thought that was a very issues-oriented election till the assessment came out. Which, by the way, I thought Beck ran a great campaign. But I thought up until that point, the reality was you didn't hear anything about a driving record, which was a counterbalance to the property tax assessment. I've told people this story before. We were up 6 points and winning that race until until Christmas trees came back to bite us, I would say. And in 2 weeks we transitioned to 5 points down, and the momentum was gone from us. So the campaign shifted, but before that, I would argue that campaign was mostly about issues in the state. Karcher was talking about ethics reform and her 20 points. Beck was saying there wasn't enough on property taxes. I thought it was actually a reasonably well-defined issue campaign until it went to that point.
But then it wasn't.
But that was because they had an issue that turned automatically overnight. And people thought she was a hypocritical person and therefore did not want to believe anything else she was saying. And then you would come back to the attack ads only because you were trying to raise the recognition and there was no credibility left. And it was the Christmas trees. And people couldn't believe that this individual who was wired, who did the right things ethically and stood up, could be right now selling Christmas trees and taking a $12,000 or $14,000 farm assessment, and she lost all credibility.
Al, do you agree with Brendan that elections are much dirtier today than they were 30 years ago?
I don't know if they're dirtier. It's just the whole political atmosphere in New Jersey is get you, and it's the news media, and it's everybody. So when you sit outside, and Joe knows this, or you're Governor Corzine, and you're trying to, and I say this with all due respect, trying to solicit the Alan Sagners of the world, or the Dick Leones of the world, to come into government, to give up how Brendan Byrne was able to attract those people. People look at two things. They look at the atmosphere, business people, and they look at the disclosure forms. And they say, no way. What's it your business to know what my trust funds are for my children? That's not a public...
Have we gone too far on disclosure?
I think we have taken this ball, this commission has gone totally too far and is creating an atmosphere where you can't find the treasurer today.
Dick Leone, okay? would you go into government today under today's rules as opposed to those that pertained in the 70s?
You want a completely honest answer?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I went into government in the 70s. I'm sorry I got involved in politics.
No.
Yes.
Really?
I thought you could change things and make them better, and it would last. And that turns out not to be true in New Jersey. Maybe true sometime in the future.
We're just part of the national.
It's not, I mean, other places are worse than they seem because there haven't been as many prosecutions. But New Jersey's pretty bad. We don't have, it's no consolation to the interconnection between money and politics nationally, but in New Jersey particularly, has gotten much more intense and is the sea in which politicians swim. It makes them, to mix my metaphors, it makes them, I think it brutalizes people in politics. They spend so much time raising money, so much time involved in basically an insincere interaction with other human beings, in which I have to act like Alan Sagner is brilliant because I need his check. He knows I'm only doing it because I want his check, and I know he knows. And what are the two of us really doing? What do we call that kind of stuff in other circumstances? Doing that day after day after day after day. Occasionally people come along and have a lot of money, don't have to do it. And people in business are involved in politics because they want the business, contracts. I mean, that's self-interest. That's the way capitalism ought to work. It works pretty well in our politics. But it's... When Brendan Byrne ran for re-election, the first time we had public financing before people had figured out ways around it, he had one fundraiser in the general election. One event. That was it. He didn't spend any other time on fundraising. 3 people came to that. I didn't raise any money on the first one. That's a really different atmosphere.
There are several of you around the table who have run for office. Go ahead, Bruce.
I just want to follow up on that in a global way. Because a statement like that, you were young, you wanted to change things, make them better, and assume that would last. I'm thinking about our students and the kind of people who will see this discussion on our web. Are there arenas where a young person, or from what you've observed, can change things, make them better, and last? Or are we looking at a kind of concentrated, high visibility microcosm of human nature and the way we all work together and live together in society?
I don't think there's a uniform political culture in the United States. I think many states and particular areas of this state have politics which are quite issue-oriented, which proceed along ways that are admirable, and a lot of admirable people go into politics and make great sacrifices. And I think nationally there's a considerable room for people to make a difference. I do think, though, that it is a mistake to become an apologist for New Jersey, which all of us have done, including me, over the years, because we get defensive about what people think and say about the state. It's a mistake to become apologists because, in fact, we should not be proud of what we've done. Better young people will come along and change this. Nothing stays the same. Others will look back on this 30 years or 40 years from now and say, we made a great change, we made a great difference. And I think in the area of ethics and money, which is what you're talking about now, not in the area of whether we have better mass transit or, better colleges now and other things, we do. But I think in the area of ethics and money, we haven't made the progress we thought we were going to make, and it didn't stick. Part of that was national. Part of that was Buckley decision in the U.S. Supreme Court. Part of it was
527s.
Well, that's just the most recent manifestation. Part of it was the inventiveness of campaigns. No one had invented soft money as a significant factor in campaigns in the 1970s. It's a fairly recent development.
You're saying that our political culture in this state is inferior to that of other states. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Not all other states, but
some.
Some other states.
Okay.
I mean, go out to Oregon and spend a month in Oregon, as I did once. They don't know what we're talking about.
There are people in this room who've run for office, local office, state office. I wonder if you think the process is dirtier today than it was either 30 years ago or when you ran. Granted, I saw a button that said Kiernan for Assembly. What do you think?
That was 1977, and I had been working in Trenton for Harold Martin and then for Al Bernstein and Matty Feldman. And it was Bob Torricelli who suggested I run for the open seat in my district. He was in the governor's office in those days. And I did run in 77, and I've learned since then, and John Weingart continually tells me about it, that I'm still the only person who beat Jerry Cardinale in an election. Unfortunately, it didn't last. And the district returned to its more Republican roots. But I would tell you that raising money in 1977 is an awful lot different than raising money in this part of the new century. I think I spent $25,000 on my election, which I raised from friends and family and people that I knew, not any big fundraisers. Harold Martin thought that was an obscene amount of money to spend on an election. He wanted to save this money to give it to Eagleton to build that library in there. I just came through an election as a spectator, pretty much, on in the 14th legislative district. So I've been through a clean and fair election, and I didn't think it was either during any of the time that we had that election going on. It's not easy to raise $25,000 in 77 or $1 million today, but it's pretty hard to get 800 people to give you $10. That took months to collect that money from both parties. And then when they did get it, they found the restrictions on how they could spend it and what they could use it for, particularly onerous and difficult. I mean, that election's over. I don't think there were a lot of changes. I don't think the numbers increased. But and I'm glad we tried it. But I think an awful lot needs to be done to refine that process, and particularly with the outside groups that came in and ran against Linda Greenstein. I realize that I'm a civil libertarian, I'm a card-carrying member, but I'll tell you, it was pretty hard to deal with when you had an enemy out there that you couldn't identify. It was an awful lot like the blacklisting days, which I do remember. So I think we got a long way to go on this, and I don't see any solutions. I'd like to talk about other stuff because I don't have any solutions to the campaign finance problem.
Tim Carter, you've run for office how many times?
Twice.
Twice.
I run every 25 years.
You can give us the perspective.
Well, I ran into that about 23 or 24 years before my next race. I ran in 1977 for the State Assembly. I raised $60,000. It was the second, I believe, the second highest amount behind Steve Persky, who dwarfed like a $250,000 campaign around his race in Atlantic City. And I ran in 2002 for Congress. The question that I think is difficult to wrestle with in terms of the campaigns, and I don't think that the issue is, I think that money is a very big part of it, but I think it's almost more fundamental that the people who are responsible for designing how we change this process are those like us in this room who are part and parcel and practitioners of the system that exists. So the challenge of changing that falls on people who have either succeeded or participated in the system that's there. My view of elections is that we have, for many of the reasons stated here about the quality of the debate, the amount of time spent raising money, which has clearly changed, and its importance in the process, which has become increasingly corrosive, but it wasn't irrelevant before, is that we don't look at the process as one designed to serve the electorate, but as one designed to serve those who are elected. And if you started with how do you actually engage people who have a limited time and tolerance for public discourse and debate in a way that would be both informative and encourage participation, I think you can find tools that would change that. And it would be as simple as proscribing forms of discussion and dialogue that are free and available, and that with the growth of the internet, increasingly free and increasingly available, that would be instantly informative. So if you took the generation that falls below those in this room, or several generations, and said somewhere in the 10 or 12 days before an election, or the 2 or 3 months before it, you can actually instantly find out what you want to know about candidates and make up your mind at the time you're doing it, we'd be improving the system. If we took paid television off the table entirely and said it's not there, 80% of the money that we're talking about in this room as being needed would be either not needed or diverted to other purposes.
I don't know why we've never passed a law mandating free television.
And by the way, that is true in England. I happen to just learn this. That they don't allow paid television. There is available television, but it's very strictly prescribed. So there are easily accessible to anyone who would want to redesign this system ways of encouraging or even demanding greater participation. I mean, I've raised a question in my own mind as to why you have to have a deadline when the polls close and no one gets to vote, particularly in a presidential election or in important elections. Why not wait until you've gotten participation up to a certain threshold that says when we've managed to get 50 or 60% of the electorate to actually participate, that then we said, I'm not sure that it's practical, but to me, these are all issues that deserve debate, that turn the ball away from how does the incumbents, and I include all of us in this room as having been part of that process, the incumbents succeed, and how do we actually salvage democracy and ensure that the public has faith in it. And I think it's a big challenge.
Becky Perkins, you've run for freeholder once, twice? Twice. You want to jump in here on the process?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I still in many ways view myself as a New Jersey outsider. I've lived in New Jersey for 30 years, but I came here, was privileged actually to serve in the last year of the Byrne administration. But I'm from Kansas, and when I arrived here, there was a vast world of difference. In the sense that a lot of things were just kind of taken for granted here. Hudson County, South Jersey, everybody was just kind of wink and nod, and that's the way it is in New Jersey. And I think that the culture of, sure, politicians do deals, politicians have machines, and the machines just get out the votes, it's kind of a done deal. That worked for a long time, but I think the result of that is that people are now disenchanted with the process, and that's why we're seeing the turnouts. Not the off years. We have elections all the time. People are tired of all of that, and as a result, they're just opting out. I work primarily now with women, getting women involved in politics, and women feel shut out of the system, but frankly, we're all kind of shut out of the system. New Jersey is so small, legislative districts are so designed, there are no surprises anymore. So it's very difficult to get...
Well, we all just surprised by the number of women who
You know, as Debbie Walsh says, you keep indicting the men, it's going to happen. So it's starting to change, but I think until we break through those barriers and show people that we're hearing them, I think people are talking to us, people are engaged, they're sending us a message. The message is they're going to opt out of this system because they don't like it. And when we get that, things will change.
Leonard, you've run for office a number of times, both federal office and state office, and everybody, there's already been a reference made this morning to what you might run for federal office again, or at least the newspapers this morning are stirring that up. Do you think campaigns have changed since your father's day?
I only observed those campaigns as a small child. I do think New Jersey is a rough and tumble environment, and I tend to agree with Mr. Leone that it may be rougher here than in other parts of the country for various reasons. Given the fact that the media markets here are among the most expensive anywhere on earth, I think that is part of the situation. I do believe that money is more relevant today than it was 2 generations ago, perhaps even a generation ago. And I certainly agree that our problems in New Jersey regarding ethics are serious and are probably more serious than many other states. There are other states that have significant ethics problems, but we shouldn't be comforted for the race to the bottom. And I believe that we have significant problems regarding pay to play and other matters. And also, more fundamentally, on matters of public policy, Michael, I think that we have great problems in New Jersey regarding levels of taxation, levels of debt, various levels of government, many of them overlapping. And some of these problems are new in the last generation, particularly the enormous level of debt in this state, which is new and certainly was not the way Governor Byrne governed. And these are very, very serious problems.
Let's hear from some people who haven't spoken yet. Rick Thigpen, you were involved in campaigns when you were executive director of the state committee, and your father's a county chairman in Essex. Comment on what you've heard so far.
Well, I certainly want to talk to Ruth's point first off, which is, it always struck me that the reason to get involved in politics was to try to change things and to try to make a difference. There's no question it's very challenging, and there are a lot of people who have different points of view than you do, so it's going to be very difficult to make your point of view endure. But that's the name of the game, and I wonder how people can endure the challenges of politics if they're not in it to change things and make things better that they believe in. One of the things I'd certainly like to bring into this as we talk, because the name of the game in politics is winning, not public discourse or debating issues. People are in it to win. And there's a big difference between the electorate and the general population. And I think that's something that's very important also. All of us who practice politics pay very close attention to that difference, and I think that difference is decisive on how people conduct campaigns. The electorate is more educated, it's more affluent, and it's whiter than the general population, and everybody counts on that, I think, and pays close attention to that. Another point I'd like to mention is, I'm a history buff, and I was reading recently about George Washington. One of the things that some contemporary observers credited him with in terms of why he was an attractive candidate to be commander-in-chief of the Continental Army was he was personally wealthy. He was able to endure the privations of public service, and it freed him from certain tensions. So the attraction of money to politics, or the connection, has been there a long time, and I don't think it's going to go away. The Supreme Court won't allow it to go away right now, and maybe by cutting off people's access to television, the campaign might make a big difference. But I would certainly like to, at some point, have us talk about this demographic issue. Our state is changing. It makes our state different than a lot of states in this country. I think it's a very good thing. And I think our decision makers are lagging behind that change, and I think it accounts for our government not addressing some of the real challenges we have in front of us, because...
Amplify what you're saying. What do you mean?
I think that one of the experiences I've had in politics was as a consultant for the Redistricting Commission, and the Voting Rights Act was a big part of that issue. It has had a big impact on the districts that we have in front of us now. I personally believe it was the reason that the Democratic map was chosen over the Republican map, because of that federal law. And it is beginning to change the way our legislature looks in New Jersey. We had the election of Bob Menendez. That was a threshold that we've crossed that is maybe the beginning of a new day. But I'm from Essex County. We still can't elect a county executive of color in our county. I think that's true in a lot of
We
places.
just elected a Latina state senator, the first ever, right?
Yes. We have 2 African-American state senators. We have a Latina state senator. So demographic changes are beginning to change politics, in my point. And it's beginning to make a difference in how things are conducted. The rules are beginning to change as well. So I think that it would be enormous if everybody participated in elections. What was the turnout percentage, Rob, in this last election, you think?
30 or 31.
Was that high? I thought it was even lower than that. It would, if you're running a campaign with limited money, you have to pay attention to that. You have to know who's going to vote and pay attention to those people, not the whole population. And that really changes the way the discourse goes as well. That's a big deal to me.
Before we move on, we want to call on Tim Bersolati to give us a little more fodder, food for thought. Tim, go ahead.
Tim, by the way, is the director of the Rutgers Eagleton poll, and we've asked him to take a look at the last 30 years in terms of the poll's findings and discuss some larger themes that some of those polls have brought up.
Good morning. Thank you for carving some time in the program for poll data. I'm a little intimidated by the room. It makes me remember a time when my wife and I were living in North Carolina, and we had very dear elderly neighbors, and one took sick, and I took over a sweet potato pie, the first one I'd ever baked, and my wife said, "You're taking over a sweet potato pie. You're a Yankee from Pittsburgh, and that's a house full of experts. You sure you want to do this?" Well, I did, and they, being Southerners, were simply very gracious and said thank you. But I have the same feeling here today. So I come here with my data, but with equal measures of humility and a great deal of admiration for the folks in this room and the things you've done for the people of our state. So while I'm talking about the numbers, I'm eager to hear your feedback as well, because those numbers may have driven you, and I suspect you all drove some of those numbers. So I'm ready to go.
John House.
Yep. All right, we need to back up. There we go. Looking back, looking forward, lessons from 36 years of the Rutgers Eagleton poll. Please advance. I'd like to do a little name that year. Which year were survey respondents most likely to say that taxes are the most important issue in the upcoming general election? 1971, 1991, or 2007? Next slide, please. All of the above, of course. Next. About half of survey respondents say that the extent of political corruption in New Jersey government is the same this year as in previous years, meaning a lot. 1973, 2004, or 2007? All of the above. You know where I'm going with this. We'll just do one more. About 3/4 of survey respondents in New Jersey could not identify the legislative offices that are on the ballot in the upcoming general election. 1971, 1991, or 2007. Next. Again, all of the above. There are lessons in all of the data here. We are consistent, we New Jerseyans. In a number of ways. We care about the cost of government, but what we see from the data is that New Jerseyans will pay more if they're given a sound rationale. The second lesson that I want to talk about today, we want our representatives to govern us honestly, but New Jerseyans, we hold few illusions about whether that can actually happen. And then finally, New Jerseyans do pay attention to politics, the previous data notwithstanding. But many voters tune in late in the campaign, and there are all sorts of implications for those of us who watch politics, both looking back and looking ahead to 2008 and beyond. So, paying for government. Obviously, we want to go back to 1977 because it's an extraordinary case study that holds lessons for today, particularly as Governor Corzine takes on the budget problems that are coming up in the coming fiscal year. We asked in 1977, at the start of that year, for Governor Burns' job approval rating, and what we found was that 19% of registered voters rated the job that he was doing as excellent or good. 78% rated the governor's job performance as fair or poor. This was after the passage of the tax package that included the income tax. Next slide, please. We also asked, for whom would you vote in the upcoming election? Governor Byrne, an unnamed Republican, depends on the candidate, neither or don't know. What we see here is not promising for the start of the political cycle. Next slide, please. And here we see why. Should the tax package be reauthorized when it comes up for a vote in the legislature in 2 years? 29% said yes, 56% said no. Clearly a key issue. A lot had changed by the time the election rolled around. By late October of 1977, this is our last pre-election poll in that cycle, Governor Burns' job approval rating had improved. Excellent or good, 31%. Fair or poor, 43%. 44% rated the governor as an effective leader. 46% rated him as ineffective. We asked that same question. We had a bit of a change in the question wording, but quite a remarkable difference from January to October in the space of 9 months. Should the tax package be reauthorized in 2 years? It's now an even split. 41% it should be passed. 40% it should expire. 2 wait and see. 6 pass with revisions, and 10 don't know. Next slide, please. Again, reminding what we saw in January, 29-56, and then advance again to 41-40. What was going on during this campaign? Well, I suspect, not having been around, but having looked through the data, once voters considered the trade-offs, support for the income tax increased. Here's a question from that same final pre-election poll. Local schools must be supported by some sort of tax money. If you had to choose, would you prefer paying for schools through the state income tax or through local property taxes? And what we see, 52% say the income tax, 33% say the property tax. So when the issue is framed, not so much as taxes or no taxes, but a trade-off and how you want to pull something off, we actually see majority support for something that in the beginning of that cycle really looked like it was going to doom the governor in his re-election bid. And we all know how this cycle turned out. The campaign discourse had an effect on voters' attitudes. We have to be cognizant of political context, though. For every 1977, we can talk about a 1993, where Governor Florio had a very different outcome. Talk radio, fueling opposition to taxes and the tax increase that had occurred. And there was a national political mood of real impatience with the Democrats. But again, the context has swung back again. In ruminating about the outcome of the legislative elections of 2 weeks ago, think about this. How many state legislators lost re-election this year for having voted to increase the sales tax in 2006? It wasn't even an issue. Again, here was a time when a governor, in this case Governor Corzine, used his bully pulpit to argue that this was something that the state needed, and it caused barely a ripple in terms of the political effects. And that is one of the lessons that we all ought to think about as we head into 2008 and the legislature has to take on a really thorny budget. Corruption in government. Again, throughout our history, we've done 163 statewide polls since that first one in September of 1971. Citizens have been concerned about corruption throughout the poll's history. Consider responses to a question we posed in the final pre-election survey in 1975. Is your state government very, somewhat, or not at all corrupt? And of course we see very corrupt, somewhat corrupt, 62%. So 80%, 4 out of 5 voters perceive some level of corruption in the state government. And we see an increasing percentage of voters in recent years saying there's a lot of public corruption in New Jersey. We look, and this is a trend from our poll from January, February 2003, up to our most recent poll, our pre-election poll in October of 2007. The percentage of voters saying there is a lot of political corruption in New Jersey, 39% in early 2003, all the way up to 66%. In the poll that we just took. Now you look at this and you think, well, why aren't they turning the rascals out if we've got this perception of great public corruption? Is it a result of redistricting and the lack of competitive districts? Or are voters resigned to having corruption in government? It may be that right now voters do not believe state government can police itself. A year ago, working with the Rutgers Ethics Initiative at the Rutgers Business School in Newark, we posed some questions about ethics in government, including this one. Many people are concerned about political corruption in New Jersey, especially concerning campaign finance and the awarding of government contracts. In your opinion, whose leadership would be most effective in raising ethical standards on these matters? We offered a series of options: the governor, the state legislature, state and federal prosecutors, business leaders or citizen groups. And we don't see a clear majority for anyone. We do see a plurality saying you have to leave it in the hands of the citizens to push for this because we just don't think these other players can do it. Even combining the governor and the legislature, who, from a practical standpoint, are responsible for ethics reform, only a third of voters were confident that they could pull it off. The final lesson that I want to draw is one of a political nature as opposed to a policy nature, and that is keeping an eye on the voters and the shifting opinions of voters as campaigns unfold. We know from experience that the outcome of state elections can be hard to predict unless you're polling right up to the very end. In many of our pre-election polls, 1/4 to a third of voters who give a preference say they've reached that conclusion within the past couple of weeks. And this was certainly the case in the first gubernatorial election where we posed that question in 1981, 89, 93, 97, and 2005. The exceptions were 2 races where the victor finished with a fairly comfortable margin. 1985, when Governor Kane was running for re-election, and then 2001, when voters appeared to have made their decisions fairly early in the campaign and when Governor McGreevey won election. So the lesson there, we like to say voters aren't knowledgeable, but speaking now as a political scientist as well as a pollster, my argument is that they're really efficient processors of information. While we all live and breathe politics, the average person has a tremendous number of demands on their time and attention, and they'll tune in when they have to, when they're ready. That's something we ought to keep in mind as we look back to 2007, when we were caught off guard by the outcome of the voting on the state ballot questions, for sure. But also as we look ahead to 2008, with the horse race polls that we, including Eagleton, are taking in New Jersey for the upcoming primary and general election, and then beyond to 2009, when the Assembly and the governor will be up for re-election as well. Thank you for your attention. I just wanted to create a context to maybe talk a bit more about politics in the period we're covering. It's been a real pleasure to present this to you.
How do you figure the fact that more and more voters are voting absentee and early?
That presents a real challenge for polling, for sure. In the last 2 statewide elections for governor and Senate, our final pre-election poll, we've had to ask not if the election were held today, because for some the election is already over, but have you voted? And if you have, for whom did you vote? And then add them into our projected outcome. New Jersey, early voting is really in its infancy, but places like Texas and Tennessee, Texas, a quarter of the electorate cast their ballot early in the presidential election in 2004. And as that becomes more and more common, pre-election polls are going to have one would like to think, an easier time of predicting the outcome, but maybe not. Folks may feel very private about a vote they've already cast.
Presidential election is going to be over February 4th.
What did your final poll this year say about the ballot question, stem cell research?
Well, our final poll was a very humbling experience this year. I like to say we nailed it on open space, but if I do that, then I have to explain why we didn't nail stem cell. We called stem cell passing by a very comfortable margin, 57 to 36. And I've had lots of conversations and time to reflect on what the heck happened. We were in the field 2.5 weeks before the election. And at that point in time, another question that we had asked was whether folks had made decisions about their choices in the legislative races. And a third of independents had not made a choice yet. So there was a lot of fluidity. And we, if in order to call it correctly, we would have had to poll up through the final weekend to catch the organizing of the opponents of the stem cell initiative. And in a low turnout election, a fired up minority of sorts can really make a difference. On the budget sales tax question, looking back, our question was clearer than the ballot question. We simply asked people whether they supported or opposed dedicating 0.5 cent of the sales tax to property tax relief. If you go back and reread the ballot question, it says, do you support dedicating 1 cent of the sales tax to property tax relief, which was the net effect. Apples and pomegranates is my conclusion there. We didn't poll on the question involving cleaning up the language in the state constitution to refer to people with mental disabilities as the insane or idiots. But I'm struck by the 40% of the voters who voted against that. Simply reflecting, I think in part, a segment of the electorate who just went out and said, I'm going to vote no on everything because right now I'm frustrated and angry about state government. There's no
mistake to change that.
Well, think of all the people we disenfranchised. There's no logical explanation for voting that down. In fact, prior to the poll, John asked if we were going to poll on that question. I said it's a valence issue. Why would anyone, other than probably the strictest civil libertarian, oppose the constitutional language change? So, a humbling experience for myself and my colleagues in polling, but with a lot of valuable lessons.
In fact, in the poll you did, on the ballot issue, stem cell was ahead by more than open space.
Oh,
at that
yeah.
time. Open space was
Absolutely. Open space was
Tim, remind me,
54-39.
or people in the room, when, this all goes very quickly for me once it's over, when did the churches come out in the strongest way on the stem cell issue?
The Sunday prior, there were inserts in church bulletins.
Where was it at the time that we polled?
We were,
in terms of organized and outspoken, clear?
There were bookends. We were in the field from October 18th to the 25th. Churches showed a video on October 7th about stem cell research. I saw it at the church that I attend. And that was ostensibly Respect Life Sunday in the Catholic Diocese in New Jersey, but it certainly also coincided with the political season. But I think there were more reminders, and people were tuning in later in the game. We were out of the field by October 23rd, and of course, the election was November 6th, so there was a good chunk of time for things to move around.
Thank you.
Thanks for your attention.
I want to continue hearing from people we haven't heard from yet and ask for comments on elections over the past 30 years that stand out in your memory, either because you were involved, because you thought it was an exciting election, a great election, or a terrible election. Nancy Becker.
Well, I've probably been in more elections that have been terrible elections than positive elections. But I also wanted to reflect, when I started in New Jersey politics, coincided with the time that Governor Byrne was elected, and I was the first executive director of Common Cause. And we were pushing an ethics agenda, open meetings, public finance of elections, both primary and general election. And probably one of the only fights I ever had with a legislator on the floor of the Assembly was with Al Burstein, who I later became very good friends with, because I was furious that his legislation did not include primaries as well as general elections. Clearly, at that time, I was very idealistic, and I wanted a revolutionary change as opposed to evolutionary, which I learned over my 30 years in politics. The campaign that I was involved in that was most involved in that was a tough campaign was the campaign in the primary election between Tom Kean and Ray Bateman, which Ray Bateman won. I worked for Tom Kean. I was his issues person, and it was an exercise in frustration. I think that the traditional supporters of the party supported Ray Bateman, and it was clear he was going to win the election, and we were all pretty discouraged at that time. I also wanted to reflect on the campaign finance issue, though, because after I left Common Cause, I became a lobbyist. I just retired from 30 years owning my own firm, and I would tell you that I, like Dick Leone, felt when I got into it, I wanted there to be a change. I wanted the change to be permanent, and I was frustrated because clearly the changes did not remain. And as a lobbyist and as someone who was constantly asked for campaign contributions, the demands over the years became more and more expensive. Campaign contributions are solicited from lobbyists year-round. There is never any break, and there's an expectation that one gives at all times. The other thing that happened as a change is that with leadership funds, and where funds are funneled, the great majority of funds are funneled through the leaders, one doesn't get a chance to choose the candidates as one would like to choose because of those leadership funds. And I think the changes really need to occur in New Jersey.
Greg Edwards.
Michael, as I reflect on at least my experience with legislative races, which I guess got started in earnest in 1981, continuing through almost to the present, the trend that I find the most fascinating but also the most disturbing has been referred to here is the penchant for candidates, particularly in highly competitive, well-financed races, to focus almost exclusively on the personal attributes of the opposition. To the extent that I think we've got campaigns that are largely devoid of issues to the voter's perspective, and we're learning things about candidates that we probably didn't care to know about. We've talked a little bit about the 12, and I frankly do not believe that Jennifer Beck decided to run for the state senate because she wanted to demonstrate to the world that Ellen Karcher was participating in the farmland assessment program. Similarly, I doubt very much that Ellen Karcher decided that she wanted to campaign against Jennifer Beck because she wanted to prove she was a bad driver. So, and I think the worst of all examples, and the most embarrassing to me because it was from my own party, I just find it amazing that people would sit down in a room and decide, we're going to campaign against this woman because her spouse is doing his job. I refer to the charge made in the 8th Legislative District against the Democratic candidate whose husband was representing one of the individuals involved in the planned Fort Dix attack. I can't imagine sitting in a room like that, which I've done many times in my life, and saying, boy, there's a great issue, we need to use that. I think I would have said to myself, well, yeah, maybe a few people would get excited about this, but is it really fair? I mean, do we want to attack an attorney for doing his job? My point is, what is it that gets candidates from the point of wanting to do, as Nancy Becker and others said, change the world, make a difference, to wallowing in this mud? We don't talk about
Dick Zimmer was a well-respected public servant until he ran for statewide office against
Dick
Bob
Zimmer was
Torrey.
president of Common Cause when I was the executive director.
I don't know how many of you remember the name Harvard G, but Dick Zimmer put campaign commercials on television accusing Bob Torricelli of aiding and abetting some Korean immigrant named Harvard G, whose sin I don't recall, but it was so far afield from both what the election should have been about and who Dick Zimmer was, but which is, I think, by way of saying, this has been going on forever. This is not new. Everybody talks about, go back to Thomas Jefferson. He was a dirty campaigner. Hasn't this stuff been endemic now?
Well, it seems to me that the first thing candidates have to do, and Rick mentioned this, is win. They've got to win in order to change the world or change things, whether they change things permanently or temporarily. And in a competitive race, winning is a lot. Winning isn't everything, but losing is nothing. And the real question is, does attack ads, negative campaigning work? Yes. And I'm inclined to think it does work because all of the political consultants out there who are advocating that are not idiots. They've got experience.
They were.
Pardon me?
Ask Ellen Karcher if they were.
Well, they were. And that drives it in a competitive race. I mean, one reason we should have more safe districts, you don't have to resort to that kind of language. It's the other thing, and I may as well, bring out your behavior in this too, as a member of the press. Not only as a member of the press, but as a member of, the public media. It's not the campaign may go on, but the campaign only exists as we see it, as it's mediated by the press. It's the press that wants this garbage. And it's the press, the television press, the radio media, the blogs.
And why do you think that is?
Well, we'll get to that. But, I accused Michael when he had the two candidates, Beck and Karcher, on his program of only asking them about their respective attacks on one another.
That's not true, Alan. That's not true. That's the part you remember, Alan, because I asked them about monetization and I asked them about school funding and Abbott schools, but you remember the mud.
Actually, it's the only part I saw. I tuned it in because it had in the newspaper, in the guide, it said mud from this side, so I didn't have to watch the others. But the answer is that it's what the media wants, what the media reports, and what people say. Now, why does the media do it that way? I guess because that's what people want to say.
That's what people respond to.
We have met the enemy, he is us.
I've done a lot of presentations at casinos over the years where somebody in the audience says, why does the press always focus on the negative? Why don't you focus on the positive? And I say, okay, imagine two stories in your newspaper tomorrow morning. Casino gives $25,000 to local charity, or casino executive steals $25,000 from the treasury in the building. Which one are you going to read first? Doug.
What was the answer?
I think it's obvious. Maybe my example isn't as good, as sharp as it should be, but
a story like that is a bit different from the mushrooming, the ratcheting up, the escalation of something like a few Christmas trees or the driving tickets that Beck got. And so what happens now is, absolutely, if there's something that speaks to and leads to a deep ethical lapse, corruption, inability to serve properly, you would want the public to know that, and we would depend on you for that. But feeding into the kind of thing that I think consultants tell candidates, because yes, it's about winning, and probably scare candidates into doing things that they would prefer not to do, that is, making choices and emphasizing things they prefer not to. I think that isn't necessarily about a deep ethical issue or a major matter of someone's inability to serve.
Isn't that for the electorate to decide in some way?
It may be, but the effect on the electorate, look, I think there are many of us in this room who we've all been involved for a long time. We all think the process is important. And yet, for people like us to say we were disgusted or we were horrified, I mean, I was having studied women in politics for the last 30 years, seeing this as two women in this, Karcher and Beck, knowing both of them, having respect for both of them, it made me personally very unhappy to see that they were the example of what was bad this year in campaigning. And, you know, I'm sure that neither one of them started out thinking that they were going to campaign at that level. I'm not taking, you know, they have to take responsibility for what they agreed to, but all the pressures are there. And the public, you talk about the 30% or, you know, our general concern about turnout. The public, that's all they see on TV. I mean, I had friends in New York saying to me, oh, that race in New Jersey between those two women, because they saw this on television. There was a lot of money in that advertising campaign. I don't know how you stop it, but I don't want to step back from believing that a combination of attack media, paid television, and I think the media's need to go after anything that looks like you could ratchet it up into an intense fight, that combination isn't having a major effect on what the political culture feels like, looks like. And again, I go back to, you know, what we can tell our students about why public service is an honorable career to consider as they're making choices early in their lives. So I think it's very disturbing. I realize this is a kind of naive, idealistic statement because it has nothing to do
By the way,
with the reality
if
of what's
Beck's driving record was so irrelevant, why did Zulema Farber lose her job?
Well, first of all, from what I heard about Beck's driving record in actually watching your program, your discussion, it didn't sound like the same kind of thing to me. I mean,
No, it wasn't, but that's for the electorate to determine, is it not? I mean, I think Zulema Farber got a bum rap myself, but I saw some hands, Doug and Rick and John Weingarten, in that order going.
A couple of quick points. One, just to clarify an earlier comment, the spending caps that I'm talking about are candidates' spending caps. That's what I think should be applied in the general election, not the overall campaign. I'm talking about the contributions that a self-funded candidate makes. I think that's a problem. The other issue that I think is relevant...
You mean you want your money back?
Well, I've already said that I think when you swap candidates, you should get your money back. What I would also say that part of the larger context of the past 30 years or so is has to take the judiciary in New Jersey into account. That has had a huge impact with regard to, I think, the public perception of what politics is all about. I mean, the four big decisions that have really driven the major public policy making, you know, in education and land use and public finance are huge. And I think there is a perception on the part of the public that the resolution of issues can be ultimately decided by the judiciary. I think that there is a reality there that has not been there previously. When I started actually 30 years ago, just this month, in politics, Joe Gonzalez hired me.
1 second, just to clarify.
Yes.
The Mount Laurel decision, the Abbott decision, the Lance versus McGreevey.
Well, that helped. Leonard helped correct the situation a little bit, but I think.
And then the swapping decision.
Well, swapping the candidates actually I think is far more consequential than people realize. But with regard to the issue of the public indebtedness, I think the Supreme Court really has really acquiesced to an executive push over several administrations, meaning that the caps, or rather the constraints on public indebtedness almost don't exist anymore. I think that's a very serious problem, and the court allowed that.
And you started to say something about when you got into politics.
Well, it happens to be my 30th anniversary. It was mid-November 1977. Joe Gonzalez had met with me in the summer because he said, look, Doug, why don't you be research director? We're going to be in the majority. He left Army, didn't go out and pick the carpeting, I think, for his office in Trenton. And then, thankfully, he was an honest guy, and he kept his commitment to me and hired me, even though the staff was being reduced. But that beginning of 30 years ago, a lot of what I have seen has been driven by the judiciary. And I think that involvement politically, in addition to public policy, I'm talking about the politics in addition to the public policy, is very significant.
Don, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in because Doug mentioned the Torricelli-Lautenberg ballot decision. I wondered, and I think it is very consequential and that people aren't thinking about that more, but I first wanted to know how many people in the room agree with the Supreme Court's decision?
Which one?
On the substitution of Frank Lautenberg for Bob Torricelli on the Senate ballot against Doug.
Does this break down along party lines? Or
Greta, you agree with it? You're the only one?
No, I thought it was.
No, we agree.
Rick? Becky? Tim? I disagree. I think it was a bad decision. But as Doug pointed out, what now stops that type of substitution in the future when one candidate is obviously failing very late in the race? I mean, I've been surprised there hasn't been more effort to confront that decision and its future impact.
Well, the comments made on the polling are very much related to that. Indeed, people are voting earlier in the election. It raises questions about basic democratic theory. We know that in the 2002 Senate race, there were a lot of, it was stopping an election in progress. There were a large number of absentee ballots that had already been returned and voted. So stopping an election in progress, if indeed that is going to be the momentum in terms of people voting earlier, raises an additional issue with regard to what democratic theory is about.
Rick, you wanted to jump in?
That's a point well taken. Well, I would say if Bob Torricelli had, quit kind of out of a arrangement, I would maybe agree more likely to rob the voters of a choice of candidates because of what happened, I think, was maybe where I might disagree. Michael, I was going to say before that George Bush seems to have really taught me a serious lesson about this question, which is in 2004, the sitting President of the United States got more votes than any person in the history of our country has ever got. As I understand it, most of the polls showed most people did not agree with him on the issues. But him and his team showed the genius to understand what moved people, and it wasn't the issues. If they talked about the issues, I think they would have lost that election. He represented people's values, which is a little bit more intangible. And I think like in a state like Ohio, it was that gay marriage being on the ballot. They purposely forced this issue. They got people riled up to vote who were conservative, and it worked for them. It seems to me there's a real lesson in what he did in 2004 for us all to pay attention to.
What's the lesson?
That's a good question. I'm still trying to understand. But it's clearly that standing on the issues is not what elections are all about. Understanding what moves people is much more important, and the case of the Karcher race, I think, resurfaced that. It wasn't about the farmland assessment, but it somehow fit into her image of being above the political fray and integrity, and it somehow hurt her image. The Zimmer case, he overreached, apparently. It didn't resonate. It didn't sound real. But that's the game everybody's always playing, is trying to find that thing that will make people turn against another candidate, even if that candidate is someone whose issues or credentials are more powerful. And it's a real trick to figure, but I know we're talking about New Jersey, but, George Bush, to me, it was crystal clear that you're missing something if you try to run a campaign only on the issues, that you're really setting yourself up to be beat.
Dick Leone wanted to jump in, and then we'll get to you, John. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, we're talking a little bit about this money in politics, which is the topic that I was so negative about to begin with. A little bit in a vacuum. Because of the Supreme Court decision, the Buckley decision, we can't put a cap on what individual candidates spend.
which means candidates who have a lot to spend will be very attractive to parties, and that will drive the cost of elections. In addition, one of the lessons from the Bush campaign in 2004 is not to take public financing. Then you can spend a lot of money during the period before the convention and after the convention, and the other candidate can't if he takes public financing because he's out of money and he's got to wait for the general election to start. So we complain about how important money is and how much people have to raise, and you've all read the statistics about how much a senator has to raise every day for 6 years and how much a congressman has to raise every day for 2 years to run for re-election. But we do things for this, we produce decisions which make the demand for more money even greater. And I think when the Buckley decision was made, from a free speech point of view, there's a reasonable rationale, but the consequences for politics, what the court never recognized, and is that the corruption that comes from needing more, from quantity, not just the quality of your engagement with other people, is a real kind of corruption, and that it drives out other activities in politics. And we're now at a stage where national campaigns, from the president down through the Congress, cost these enormous sums of money. And because there are a variety of loopholes that are, one person's loopholes is another person's free speech, the money finds a way into the process. And I just think, when I talked before about my feeling of being discouraged about changing things, I meant changing this. The flaw in politics when I was a young man that most troubled me was the corruption that came from money. Not just money that was raised, but people taking money. I thought that could be eliminated. I think Brendan Byrne and some other governors, people with character like Tom Kean, did things that tried to do things that would change that permanently. But it turns out to be very hard to change, and part of the reason is literally the legal structure in which we function. It doesn't permit us to do what has been done in other countries. Obviously, providing free time and not allowing people to buy time and insisting that the free time be used by the candidate, his or herself, which is the way it's done in several other countries, would dramatically change politics because it would change the demand side for money. But we can't do that here. There are a lot of things we can't do here because of our political culture, because of the legal history we have. And I think that means that it all falls back on the character of the candidates and the character of the parties and their willingness to see these things through. And that has turned out to be a frail reed, frailer than I thought it would be, I guess.
John, you've been wanting to jump in for a while.
Two unrelated things I want to say. One is just, if we're talking about the last 30 years, I just wanted to put the Rush Holt congressional campaign on the table. I think it was, there aren't particular generalizations to draw from it, because I think it's the only time since Abscam in 1980 when an incumbent member of the House in New Jersey was defeated in an election, but that's no...
Where did he beat, remind us?
He beat Mike Pappas in an election that's remembered as him winning because Mike Pappas had sang on the floor of the House of Representatives, "Twinkle, twinkle, Kenneth Star, now we see how bright you are." And he made that into a very effective radio ad. But it was an interesting... Mike Pappas did that on the floor of the House in January of 1998, and the whole campaign debated for months whether to use that or not. And they didn't decide till October to use it, and the mood had to... Ken Starr's star had sunk enough that was effective. And Jim Goodman interviewed me when he was working at the Trenton Times, called here, and I guess Ingrid Reed's phone was busy, so he talked to me and asked, and in the course of figuring out who I was, he asked if I'd worked in any campaigns, and I said, yeah, I'd worked for a guy named Joe Duffy who ran for the Senate of Connecticut, and I worked for McGovern, and I worked for Rush Holt. And he said, oh, you didn't work in campaigns, you just worked in crusades. But the other point I wanted to make is, in terms of effectiveness of government in New Jersey, I think there's a lot of attention that needs to be devoted to the bureaucracy that never is. And I think going back at least to the Florio governorship, people in state government in the bureaucracy have been told to do more with less. And there's a point at which that doesn't work anymore. And one of the things that would have been exciting about Governor Governor Forrester's administration was it was the only time that someone was running for governor as a major party candidate who'd actually had experience in the bureaucracy and knew how that worked. And I think there's sort of a trickle-down contempt that comes from the voters to elected officials and then goes down to the bureaucracy. And people in the legislature particularly, and also at times in the governor's office, tend to look on the 60,000 people who work for them as something that's sort of in the way. And going to Dick's point, I think it's really important. I used to say to classes when I would just go speak when I was a bureaucrat, really encourage people to think about working in state government, that it's an exciting place to work, you can make a difference. And I'm not so sure that's true anymore. And I think there are a lot of aspects of that. One about how you hire people and the constraints of civil service, another about how much discretion state workers are given, and also the regard in which they are held or not held by the executive and the legislature. And I think that's going to be important for anybody who's governor to try to be effective, is to realize that they can't be effective just by relying on the 20 people they bring in around them in the State House.
Well, where do you come out on that, John? I had lunch a couple of weeks ago with several people who go back actually to the minor administration with me. And their lament was every year more and more jobs are classified. And every year the governor has less and less to say about what's going on the job that he's elected to do.
I think civil service is a terrible problem. I mean, I think you have, I became an assistant commissioner at one point and suddenly had 600 people working for me, and I could hire and fire for them. You have a change in governors. The people of the state say, we want a completely different course of action. We're putting in this person instead of that person. And then you're left with people, there are a lot of issues that aren't Democratic or Republican issues and it may not matter, but you end up with people who are, it's not so much that they're not competent as they may not agree with the philosophy of the governor or of the commissioner, or they may not be the right person in the right job, or somebody long ago decided they wanted to give the person more money and the only way to do that was to promote them into a job as a supervisor, and they're not a good supervisor, they were good at whatever they did before. And the lack of discretion an executive at any level in state government has over their staff is a real serious problem.
We were here before you came, and we're going to be here after you gone.
How do you change that?
Confront the communication workers union for a start.
Well, I'm glad you said that.
I was trying to word it right.
Let me ask a question that was triggered by something Leonard Lance said about an hour ago when he talked about the need for pay-to-play reform. Comprehensive pay-to-play reform is the phrase we always hear. And we hear that from Republicans at the State House 3-4 years now consistently. What would it be like in the state if we really enacted strict pay-to-play reforms across the board, municipal, county, state, leadership packs? You just can't give money if you do business with government. I guess the ceiling in the law is $17,500, but whatever the ceiling, set your own ceiling. I guess the ways around the current law are by giving to municipal committees and by giving to leadership packs. Is that right, Leonard?
Counties.
counties, you can still give to counties?
Yes, and money is then wheeled. When I mean pay-to-play reform, I definitely mean an inclusion of not being permitted to wheel money to other parts of the state.
Does that sound like a great idea to the people in this room?
Except that just encourages more people to get into politics who can afford to self-finance. It doesn't help anybody who wants to run for office without a fortune.
Well, you'd have to have more public finance.
Well, I think that that's the more important. If you have public financing, you actually have a tool by which you can proscribe the contribution of funds. That much has been established.
If you have
and if you look at the
public
growth
financing across the board,
yeah, but you have to educate. Nobody in the public, and and the check off on your tax form that allows you to contribute to the gubernatorial election fund would demonstrate that. Nobody wants to fund elections or politicians per se, but if you look at the gross amount of money that is spent in those governmental jurisdictions and what the cost of public financing those elections would be, I think you have
At $3 million per district to completely finance the legislative election would be $120 million. Maybe the state would save that overnight with a legislature elected.
I don't think the measure is whether it saves it or not. It's whether you actually have reclaimed your government or not. I mean, what's the price of reclaiming your government from forces that are becoming increasingly influential?
And if you added up prosecutions, et cetera, you might be able to reduce that as well. Also, if you talk about what Tim is talking about, the trade-offs, you talked about the trade-offs. If you talked about the trade-offs between having a cleaner government, more responsive, and some form of public finance, and I certainly don't think you need $3 million in a legislative district. I think that's probably excessive, that perhaps you could begin to do this.
Do you think cleaner government and more responsive are the same thing?
Well, let me just ask a question, maybe I've been left behind, but wouldn't public financing and the limits on candidates, on parties, and what have you, lead to more 527s, 501c4s, which is happening in national politics? And, it seems constitutionally at this time, that is all protected by free speech. So you would essentially get into a situation where campaigns are being carried out, waged by independent groups that are not accountable to anybody except to them and their members, instead of by candidates and political parties who are accountable to the voters.
Anyone want to respond to that, Leonard?
Yes. There is a provision in the law of rescue money, and I think it certainly helped in District 14 when there was financial involvement by an outside group. I think the $3 million is an excessive amount. I thought it was excessive in the split district, and that was a change that occurred in the Assembly. The Senate had passed a much more reasonable proposal, and I believe one of the reforms out of this election cycle will be a possible extension of clean elections to include primaries in several other districts, but certainly a lowering of the amount from $3 million, which in my judgment was excessive, and I didn't vote for it.
Would you say that again? What's going to come out of this election?
There will be a series of recommendations on the success or lack of success of the clean elections experiment in this cycle, and one of the recommendations will be, I believe, to lower the $3 million amount in the split.
And that was only in a contested district. In a predominantly one-party district, the amounts were much less. Is that right?
Much less.
But you don't see a problem with independent campaigns.
I do see a problem, but I don't.
But you think it can be met?
I think this election cycle proved to some extent, Alan, that the rescue money was effective, and the fact that there was a modest amount of rescue money was put out publicly, and I think that helped the candidate by whom there was this outside targeting.
I was just going to say that when you talk about the cost of this program, you just can't talk about general elections, because if your goal is to make politics more competitive, you really need to apply it to the primaries too, and that's what makes it really expensive. You could exempt so-called safe districts from receiving money in the general election context, but you've got to include all those districts on the primary side. Otherwise, you really haven't changed the system. I just want to make one other point, Michael, if I could, on pay-to-play before you leave it. I think we need to be very careful about so-called reform that tries to bring about less corrupt government, but which I think real purpose is to alter the rules to favor some. Now, Leonard pointed out the clean elections thing and how the selection of the competitive district left a lot to be desired. It sure did. It basically said to the Democrats, you can pick the district that you want. There's nothing fair about that process. In the pay-to-play context, you can nail down all the loopholes that you and Leonard talked about. No more wheeling. Apply it to municipalities. Apply it to county committees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You will still have a law in place, however, that says to the business community, if you have a contract with government, you can't contribute Now, who holds the largest contracts with any government, county, state, or municipal? The public employees. They are completely exempted from this. Those unions are allowed to contribute. Now, if a $2,000 contribution from a business that gets its contract through a competitive process, if that contribution is corrupting, how is it that the CWA's $25,000 contribution isn't corrupting? My point is, that changes the rules of the game to favor some over others.
I'll be back. Good. Let's talk about the lieutenant governor. Is this a good thing or not? Leonard?
I think it's a terrible idea. I voted for it as a legislator, and I voted for it in the privacy of the voting booth.
You voted for it?
Pardon me, I voted against it. I voted against it. Terrible idea. It's the weakest lieutenant governor in the nation. He or she will not be presiding over the Senate. He or she will have no responsibilities except what the governor gives the lieutenant governor. And the person does not become governor for the rest of the gubernatorial term should the governor leave office early. It's only until the next election, so it's not at all like the presidency and the vice presidency. And it weakens the state Senate as an institution. And one of the
how does it weaken the state Senate?
Because at the moment, the president of the Senate becomes the governor upon the resignation or death of a governor. And I think the experience with Governor Cody was a good experience. And anybody who becomes president of the Senate in modern New Jersey, in contemporary New Jersey, is well qualified.
Would you include DeFrancesco in that?
Yes, I think both of them served very ably. Governor DeFrancesco, particularly after the tragic events of 9/11, where I think he really did an excellent job. The McGreevey situation was much different because we didn't have a governor leaving office to go into a national administration, with everyone congratulating that governor for a promotion to become in a presidential cabinet. We had a terrible scandal in this state, and as a result, the governor had to leave. And I just think in both of those situations, the current situation proved to be good, and we are creating the weakest lieutenant governor in the United States.
I'd jump in. I mean, it's not the issue of qualifications, Leonard, but how do you govern from both the executive and the legislative branch at the same time?
Well, that's been taken care of, because in this interim 4-year period, we have a system where you would have to leave the presidency of the state Senate. We are now in an interim period where if you are the Senate president and if the governor leaves, you become governor. You are no longer Senate president. That situation's been taken care of.
Does anybody want to speak up on behalf of the lieutenant governor concept?
I just think we're, the only state in the country, I mean, one of the few without it. And
No, that's not accurate.
Well,
that's not accurate. There are other states that don't have the lieutenant governor, and can anyone in the room name a lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania?
I think that the vacancies, and the current law may not be written as it should be, but I think the vacancies that have existed in the past few years, if that doesn't scream that we need a lieutenant governor in the state, to me,
you don't think that moving the Senate president into the governorship is a useful idea?
I don't.
Why not?
I don't. I think, again, the conflict between, to serve in both at the same time, I think, as we've had them doing.
That's no longer the law.
So that's certainly an improvement, but I think that's an issue that I just don't see how you get past that. So.
Can I ask somebody to comment on something? I have a feeling maybe in New Jersey, corruption is amateurish and sporadic and dealt with, whereas in a lot of other states, it is institutionalized. And I once asked a question of a man who does buying and selling of real estate in Manhattan for the Prudential, if that was so. And he said, let me put it this way. In New York City, there's no penalty for clipping.
For what?
Clipping. And I think it's taken for granted over there. You want to do something in New York City, you hire an expediter. That means what it means. Anyway, Anybody
What does it mean?
What does it mean?
Yeah, what does it mean?
That graft is institutionalized. You got to pay off someone. You got to hire somebody who can get things.
So you're saying we're not really as corrupt as our reputation, that corruption exists everywhere?
I'm saying that corruption is everywhere, yes. And that we get more publicity for it, not that we're better at work. But
Because we're better at unearthing it nowadays? Or
I think we do.
Anybody?
Okay.
Well, I think New Jerseyans are more brazen about it. It may not be more frequent, but you look at some of the schemes that are uncovered through indictments, and you ask, well, what reasonable person would think they could get away with that?
The amateurs.
I think we're more creative about it and maybe bigger risk takers. And therein lies some of the source of the public outrage. However the case is adjudicated, you look at the indictment of Sharp James and read the particulars, you just shake your head and say, well, how could you ever think you could get away with this? And yet people try.
There are only 3 or 4 states I know reasonably well, but I think the governor's right about states like Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania. I think there are accepted practices there which I would consider corrupt that don't attract publicity from the press or activity from prosecutors. Exactly why that's true, I'm not clear. There are other parts of the country where that is not the case, as I said earlier. I do think it requires constant vigilance, and the reason we haven't made as much, we've made progress on lots of things in New Jersey in the last 30 years. The reason we haven't made more progress on this is frankly because we haven't had leadership in key posts, governor, attorney general, U.S. attorney, who focused on that. It requires constant vigilance. It's just not going to happen because of the rules.
Well, we now have a U.S. attorney who is focused on it, right?
Yes, and we get there's more publicity for it, but it's a requirement. I mean, there's certain. It would be nice if men were angels, as Madison said. You know, we wouldn't have to have this constant vigilance. They're not angels in New Jersey.
Do you think there's anything to the fact that the states you named are all part of the original 13 colonies?
I think the old, highly industrialized states have a different political culture from the culture you find in the Midwest and the West. And that's
You could add Rhode Island.
I don't know.
Add Illinois. Just the ones that come trippingly to time. So I would say that New Jersey is certainly not a North Dakota or a Minnesota.
Are they clean?
Or an Oregon. Yeah, I think there's a sort of a different political culture, traditional culture. I think they have a different level of expectations. But New Jersey is not unique. I think we're among about 12 states that have, kind of a faster and looser culture than the others.
Doug, you wanted to jump in a few minutes ago.
Well, I'm reluctant. I was glad I was given an out because I was going to disagree with Senator Lance. I've always been reluctant to disagree with Leonard. Because I happen to think he's right almost all the time. But I would disagree on this point. I think lieutenant governorship is a good move. I think that it is something that the state has needed. I think it clarifies the balance of power issue in a legitimate way. I also think that it does provide another avenue, which is badly needed in New Jersey, with regard to participation of people who want to be involved in the political process at a higher level, who are now basically shut out. We have not done well in this state with regard, for example, the role of women in statewide politics. It's an embarrassment. We should be ashamed of ourselves. So anything that facilitates a possibility of another balance, I think, is a good thing. I'm glad to hear that there's been a rectification of the issue of serving. However, the reason why I, with great incidents, disagree with you, Leonard, is that I don't think that the ability to return to the role, in other words, give up one's senatorial office, means that that problem has been addressed. In other words, if you can return to that office, you still have that conflict. So that's why I take a little different position there.
All right, we have about 10 minutes before we're going to break for lunch. Let me throw two more questions out there. Is there anybody here who can name a reform that they would like to see in place, something new between now and the next statewide election in '09?
Elimination of senatorial courtesy.
Elimination of senatorial courtesy.
Elimination of wheeling.
Elimination of wheeling.
Elimination of all those boards and commissions that carry pensions and health care.
Elimination of all the boards and commissions that give the people who serve pension credits.
Elimination of dual office.
Elimination of dual office holding grandfathered, without a grandfather clause. How about appointive office and elective office?
I would do that as well.
Anybody?
Michael, I think we should amend the Constitution to make the establishment of more competitive districts a reality, to eliminate the gerrymandering.
How do you do
Not
that?
eliminate it.
How do you do that? You said you take it out of the hands of the legislature and
No,
put
it's
it...
not a process. I think we have a pretty good process in terms of writing. I think it boils down to having a standard that says you can't draw irregularly shaped districts. Districts have to be compact. That's what allows for the gerrymander. And when you make them compact, they're more competitive.
Okay.
Authority status for the Division of Pensions and Investments.
Authority status for your old division.
I'd be flattered if you were mayor.
What would that do?
I think the issue of governance for that major state asset needs to be removed from the purview of the executive.
Anybody else? All right, that's a cleaner government in 2 years, right? Final question. I want to pick up again on something that Leonard Land said an hour or more ago. He pointed out, interestingly, that from his vantage point, the governorship is cyclical in this state, changing hands every 8 years roughly or thereabouts. I wonder whether you think that that's going to hold up in '09 or whether this is still the first term of a Democratic administration and might take until 13. Let's just go around the room. Everybody take a hit at that.
I think the governor's race is competitive in '09.
Tim?
I think that '09 will be determined in the next 6 months by what Governor Corzine does with the budget.
I agree. I think there's a tendency to want to change things. I think that will continue.
I always think it's too soon. It's too soon to know who the presidential candidates will be in '08, who will win. '09 is an eternity in politics.
Leonard?
I agree with Tim that the next 6 months may determine.
Ruthie?
I think it's the incumbents, unless there's something drastic that occurs.
You're assuming that John Corzine will be the incumbent?
Indeed.
Greta?
But what do you mean? He is the incumbent, right?
Well, that he won't go off to Washington or
I do not think he will
or
go.
bow out.
No.
Okay.
None of the above.
Okay. Greta?
I think the next governor will give the Friday after Thanksgiving off. And I think I agree with John. It's going to be competitive next year.
Well, you think Corzine's made a mistake by making the workers work on Friday?
Well, I don't think he made a mistake because he said he wasn't going to do it, and he didn't. It's one of the first things I can remember that he has told us early enough that we could prepare for, as opposed to monetization. But I do think that the state ought to take a look at its holidays for state workers, having been one for a long time, and please take away Good Friday, which has no use whatsoever in a government as a holiday, and put that one in here. That would solve some problems, and I don't think the state should be giving up a truly religious holiday, which Good Friday is.
Okay. You students want to jump in?
Absolutely not. No, I feel a little embarrassed because, there's all these individuals here. There were a couple questions that I had earlier, but they've more or less been talked about. I think that barring any sort of incredible scandal coming out of the Corzine administration, he's going to be the nominee, and if a Democrat wins in '08 for the presidential, and we see that sort of the national trend stays, I don't see in the state that really changing.
Any other student want to?
I agree with Tim. I think it's going to be defined by what Corzine does in the next few months.
With the failure of this stem cell initiative, at first, if that passed, I would have said he'd win, but now I think it'll be competitive. He put so much weight behind that bill and failed, so now I don't know anymore it could be competitive.
Doug?
I think asset monetization will make it competitive in 09.
Meaning there will be a backlash against it?
Yeah, I think that is an issue that is going to be such a hot potato that it will make the race more competitive than it would have been otherwise.
Alan?
I would put my money on Corzine, unless Michael Bloomberg runs. Then I don't.
Greg?
I think it'll be competitive because over the next 6 months the governor won't get his monetization plan, and I don't think he's going to run for re-election.
Why not?
Because he shows me no energy currently, and I just think he's decided that this is not his arena.
You think he's already made that decision?
No, I'm sorry, no. But by the end of by June, he will have.
Okay. Nancy?
I think 09's competitive for a lot of the reasons that Greg says.
Governor?
I used to have a theory that the guy with the shortest name won the election, but Whitman screwed that up too.
Let's see, Corzine is 7 letters and Christie is 7 letters. Okay.
I think 09 can be competitive, but I think it's too early to tell.
Don?
I think it's too early. I think Corzine's chances are better if he loses his asset monetization.
No. Ruth?
Agree that it's competitive and that we will know in 6 or 8 months.
I agree that the next 6 or 8 months are crucial, and I also think that Chris Christie will be formidable, but if you read this morning's Star-Ledger, he got a bad story today. Looks like cronyism delivering $52 million.
You read the whole story, Michael.
Right, it's a bad headline.
It's a bad headline. Right.
That's what did you say?
It's a headline.
It's a bad story. It's a bad story.
It had nothing to do with Christmas. Right.
It doesn't have to do. He didn't award that day.
Misleading headline. Star-Ledger. Well, okay, I'll just leave it.
Look, if I read the story, it said that Christie steered a $52 million worth of work to his old friend John Ashcroft.
Nancy? I don't think that's exactly what it said. It talked about how the dollars were divided up in terms of monitoring. And when you got done with the whole story, it seemed to me it was a big nothing.
You know, could I just...
Yeah.
The one thing I disagree with about all of these comments is I think the determinant for 2009 is how the economy performs and what that means for tax receipts, and that'll affect the budget much more than monetization. It is, if we have, and the highest, there's a very high correlation between what happens to governors and what's going on in their states' economies, even though governors have very little ability to affect that. If we have a recession and we have a sharp fall in income tax revenues and a sharp decline in the investment returns on the pension fund, we'll have a monster rolling financial crisis, and that'll be very hard. It'll be very hard on any governor. Remember, even in the miracle election that Brendan Byrne had, and that's a reminder to all of us about why it's hard to predict 6 weeks in advance, Brendan Byrne was still behind by 26 points on Labor Day. And he won by 16.
In fairness, when Ray Bankman said he got the rebate check and that was it, he was 6 points behind.
Yeah, he was already 6 points behind.
Christie Whitman was 20 points behind in early September before her income tax cut.
But I think that those economic factors are going to loom very large, probably affecting everybody in a lot of different ways. And we've had I'm shocked by the fact that the revenues are holding up. But we really don't know how the next year is going to play out. I think I've been this subprime financial crisis is very big and will affect a lot of things over the next 6 months as it begins to spill out. And I don't know how it'll play out nationally. I think actually that's going to be a major factor in the 2008 election, which is not talked about. Everybody focuses on Iraq and on other things.
On that ominous note, for a man whose wisdom is widely respected, let's go have lunch.
Thank you, Michael.